Hey friends, you're listening to the If Only I Were Wiser podcast with Raina Wilson, where wisdom and real life stories inspire and equip women to make the best choices for themselves and their families. In a world where it's easy to always feel like you're falling short, whether your health journey looks different than others or you're juggling a million things, this space is for you. This show is so much more than just wellness information. We're not here to add to the noise. Instead, we're here to equip you with wisdom in the areas you wish you were wiser, so you can find hope and joy as you navigate your unique healing journey. So grab a cup of coffee or turn up the volume over the sound of dishes and kiddos. Let's talk about what it really looks like to care for yourself and for the ones you love with grace, intention, and faith. Hey friends, welcome back to the If Only I Were Wiser podcast. This is part 2 of a 2-part series with Kelsee Moore. She previously just unpacked all things that women should know for strength training, pregnancy and postpartum, and why your burn boot camp is just not cutting it. In this episode, we're going to unpack a little bit of more hot button topics like big pharma, big food, and what it really looks like to feel nourished and training the female operator. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, guys, this was the episode that you guys were waiting for, transition off of our previous episode with Kelsee, our take 2, because I knew we had a lot to talk about. So, Kelsee, let's dive into why women and men should train differently, and specifically your recent training on how to train the female operator.
Wow, this is like my most passionate topic. So thank you for letting me talk about it. My goodness. Well, let me just give you a background of why I've taken this topic on specifically. On the previous episode, I already said that I work for the Air Force and I work for an umbrella called Air Force Special Warfare. And so that includes 3 different types of jobs: tactical air control party, pararescue, combat rescue, and combat controllers. And they all fall under the most elite airmen that we have. And I work for the tactical air control party. And recently I've actually had my first female operator come to the unit that I work for. And obviously I work as a strength conditioning coach for them. And I started having these realizations. Now, I'm a service member myself. I'm in the Army Reserves. But some of these pillars I had personally experienced, but they didn't affect me a whole lot because I was in the reserves. So I was like a weekend warrior. I'm not active duty. So I wasn't seeing these on a daily basis. But once I had my female operator come into the unit that I was working at, and I was thinking, I'm just going to call her Jane, just so that we can talk about her. But
Sure.
So I just started noticing that, if Jane had a problem or if Jane wanted to train for something specifically, would Jane feel comfortable? This is not her specifically, but in general. Do the Jane operators, would they feel comfortable going to other male strength coaches or male physical therapists, or we call it embedded care? So we call it the embedded human performance optimization teams. Those are the teams like us as government contractors who work directly for units. Would Jane feel comfortable, or if Jane got pregnant, right? If Jane got pregnant, would she feel comfortable going to the current strength coaches or current physical therapists to talk about pregnancy and how she can move to that pregnancy in a progressive way so that she can go back as fast as she can at full capacity to be an operator, right? And my ultimate answer was absolutely not. Absolutely not. No. And I started digging and digging and digging. And my husband works in special operations. So I started talking to him. And there are women that work in the umbrella of special operations as well. And I said, the females that you work with, what are their dynamics? What are their dynamics with working with their human performance teams? And he was like, oh, they're terrible. They don't work. The women don't work with them. That's just not something they're comfortable with. And I'm like, this is a problem. This is an absolute problem. And there is a complete education gap. Whether in college athletics or also working in tactical settings, of how to appropriately train female operators or elite female service members, typically because if you're traditionally, educated as a strength coach, you're not learning about the pelvic floor. You're not learning about pregnancy. 99.9% of your service members that you're working with are male for the most part, or, athletes typically revolve around male statistics and things like this. So it's just not something that's like talked about. And if it is talked about, like if a female service member gets pregnant, then she's like put in like this, she's totally pulled from her unit and she's put in like a different pregnancy and postpartum group that honestly doesn't have a lot of positive insight. Yeah, it's not great. It's not good, right? And so I just was like, that's so unfortunate, because I was thinking about Jane and I was thinking the military has pumped $4 million into this service member, and they will have a pretty poor return if Jane is not taken care of. And I thought of it as like an objective truth from that standpoint. We're talking like finances, government money, what they've invested into this warfighter, and we're just going to, tank it. And then also Jane's not going to have a very positive military experience and being able to go be a TAC P like she can be, just because an embedded care individual doesn't know how to work with her. That's insanity. Absolute insanity. So, I take this 3-pronged view, like I've talked about before, right? I've taken my personal experience and ability to work within the military, being a government contractor, so also being a strength and conditioning coach by trade, and then also being an active duty dependent, meaning that I use TRICARE myself, right? Like it's the insurance that I have, being able to take this approach. And now I'm going around speaking at different conferences and educating these embedded care professionals within the military on how to take their elite female service members and give them these specific needs or meet their specific needs so that we can keep the warfighters fighting. That is the goal. That's the goal, right? So I've had to dig, and of course I'm crunchy, I have this ancestral outlook. So I'm going to be looking at things from a much more holistic view. And, we've talked about it on the other podcast about just, understanding that cortisol in women is derived from progesterone. So if women are under eating and they're going to have a high cortisol drive, then we're going to be depleting their progesterone. And that's something to take into, that's something to note as a strength coach. And you know what that doesn't mean? That doesn't mean that you're not training her hard to avoid the cortisol spike. No, that means that you are going out of your way to make sure your female service member is eating appropriately so that she can be fueled when going through those long nights or those long training events, or, programming in the weight room. So going into specifics, like how men and women can be trained differently, I can talk about men first. Men are extremely, I call it linear, meaning like it's calories in, calories out. If you have less calories in and more calories out, they're going to lose weight. They'll probably somewhat maintain a good amount of their muscle mass. They'll move on. They'll have high work output. Guys are very good at having limited sleep. Guys are very good at working under a lot of stress. Exactly. It just is what it is. And if you look at it that primitively, guess what? Guys were out trying to find an animal for their tribe for days and days and days, right? They had to be able to be resilient in that way. So it makes sense, right? And also, men, for the most part, because they have a 24-hour hormonal cycle, meaning that their testosterone is the highest in the morning, testosterone and cortisol are both highest in the morning, then that means that every single day, if they train at the correct capacity and they eat and they sleep and they recover, and then they wake up the next morning, they have the potential, I know this is slightly theoretical, but they have the potential to feel the exact same way every single day. Now, obviously, motivation will wax and wane, right? Like, I get that. But it's very linear. Like, every day they can wake up, it's a new day, and they can train and go after it, right? Whereas for women who have a regular, non-impacted by hormonal birth control menstrual cycle, their cycle is obviously 28 to 35 days. So you take a paralleling, what's the Jane's counterpart? Jack? No, Jack? Joe? We'll say Joe.
Right?
So like
Okay.
Joe can walk in the weight room every day and feel generally the same every day. But Jane has a 28 to 35 day menstrual cycle, meaning that she could do the same exact things that Joe is doing. She could eat, sleep, train, do all the same things. But when she walks in the weight room every morning, she's probably going to feel, and I call it just a little bit different every single day, like the moon, right?
Yep.
Just slightly different every single day, you know? And does that matter? Of course it matters when you're talking about the most elite female service members. Of course it matters, right? It's like in athletics, right? Like high school sports, you can probably slap on like a very generic fitness program and they'll all probably get better. And then you go to college, it gets a little bit more refined. Right. You get to pro sports, even more specific and refined. That's how I view this, right? Yeah. We're at this point where if the military has pumped $4 million into Jane should be able to get some pretty specific tools to meet her needs. And so that may be that strength coach making adjustments every day based on how resilient she is to stress dependent on her menstrual cycle, how resilient she is to volume or heat or electrolytes and blood volume. Those are all things that are dictated by a healthy menstrual cycle. And the more information you know, the more savvy a coach can be in making those adjustments. So I'll give an example, right? So we know that women are more resilient in their follicular phase versus their luteal phase, right? Everybody knows the week before your period, you feel disgusting and terrible. So because also you have a major basal body temperature change, your basal body temperature is lower in your follicular, higher in your luteal, it means that maybe Jane will do 3 rounds of something. I'll back up. Maybe she'll do 6 rounds of something in her follicular phase. She's able to hit 6 rounds of the assault bike really well in her follicular phase. But maybe let's say during her luteal phase, you give her the exact same workout. And all of a sudden she's saying things like, wow, I can't put out today. I'm tired. I can't maintain that power output. Man, it's hot today, right? All of those things start to accumulate. And now Jane, because of all those other factors, Jane's now only doing 3 rounds, So instead, you look at that as a coach and you're saying, Jane, wow, you went down 3 rounds, you're detraining, there's all these terms that coach can use. But here's the reality. If that coach had a really positive relationship with Jane, and he or she goes, Jane, and this coach was already had an appropriate professional relationship and they were in understanding of why the menstrual cycle has such a big, impact on how Jane is training, then Jane or the coach can be like, you know what, that actually is pretty interesting because Jane, you're supposed to start your period next week. You know what we're going to do? Let's take that assault bike. Let's put it in the gym where there's air conditioning. Let's take another 5-minute break. Let's give you some more water and electrolytes. Let's accommodate some of those factors that we know are impacting the luteal phase. And Jane, give me 3 more rounds, but let's mitigate that intensity a little bit. So you're not pulling Jane from the training. You're just making some really wise decisions as a coach to push Jane along so that she stays in the group, not enabling by any sense. You are just making really specific needs and changes to Jane's training. And I just say at the end of the day, we have an incredible opportunity as strength coaches to meet the specific needs of all of our service members, especially ones that have specific genetic physiological differences.
Yep.
Like, holy smokes, like that should wake you up in and of itself, right? And so, we can dive into so many of those things. We could dive into the menstrual cycle. We can dive into musculoskeletal differences, cardiovascular differences. I mean, we can go into all of it. So just ask away of whichever one excites you the most.
Okay. Yeah. Well, because I kind of want to tackle all of those. I think the first question I would have for you is, how do we even begin to bridge that gap in education? Because I have friends prior service that have talked through, unfortunately, just like working as a female in a male dominant environment is difficult, especially with some of just like the hyper masculine aspects of military culture in general. I had a friend that I think was preparing, and I'll exaggerate a little bit maybe, but probably not that far off from the story that she shared, was preparing for a field training while she was on her period, had to very uncomfortably go ask whoever for supplies, and wrote down 100 tampons for a 3-day field exercise. And it's like that illuminates a huge gap in understanding of even just serving our female service members.
You're like 100. Whoa.
That
feels very Michael Scott-esque, It's like so hyperbolic. You're like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about.
And she was just like, you know what? No, I'll just bring my own stuff.
Yeah.
So I share that because I have close friends that are active duty and are struggling in this gap of misinformation and aren't being served well. So maybe it is just starting with the providers and strength coaches that have access to serve women specifically in training. But how do we start to serve? How do we even begin to tackle that information gap for some of these quite literally elite female athletes that are serving our nation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I obviously recognize that, like, as embedded care, as a strength coach that works for them, I am considered the subject matter expert. So I do have a duty to educate, right? Because the whole point of me there is I'm working in alignment with them with a unique set of skills and experience, and I get to illuminate that, that education to them. That takes on an extremely humble approach, I will say, leaving college athletics. Like, I say this all the time, coaches leave college athletics because, of many different factors, but they are the special sauce in college athletics. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you start working for, the tactical setting, and you're no longer the most important person in the room. Yep. Actually, you're the lowest on the totem pole because you didn't sign a dotted line to serve your country. They did. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden the power dynamic is different. And now these coaches are sitting there thinking, well, I'm the subject matter expert, but I also have no power. So how am I going to do this? Yeah. And you have to be a very creative individual as a subject matter expert working in those fields. So I do say, one, with my full-time job, I hope that's always my goal. I would hope that there are more female coaches that have a professional take, not just batting, taking a baseball bat to the heads of all these male coaches. That's not going to win anybody over. You have to be a very good coach, a professional coach, and you have to be a confident coach to take forward this information and just have a humble approach of, I think that this would expand your mind, and I think that this would help the force in general. So of course you have these subject matter experts, and I hope that there are more female coaches like me who have the ability to talk about it. In regards to within the military itself, when you're talking about green suitors, right? There are a lot of different initiatives that are really taking off right now, and I'm kind of in the middle of it, to be honest. There are a lot of different initiatives, especially here at Fort Liberty. It's called the Women in Soft Foundation, or Women in Soft Initiative, where basically it's talking about those things like hygiene, female equipment, female rucksacks, female uniforms. This is the first time, I think it's in the last 5 or 6 years, that the military came out with an actual female uniform. Praise God. Yep. Right? With stretchy pants, and not having the long crotch, So there are things moving in that direction, which is super beneficial. But I want to encourage female service members to not just roll their eyes when guys don't know something, because we cannot expect them to know it. To some extent, we can't blame them for not knowing it if women aren't going to be professional, insightful, come alongside, humble, and being willing to present information where men can hear it and actually buy into using it. I don't see that as a male problem. I actually, plot twist, I see it as a female problem. It's a problem because women are not communicating that information enough, or professionally, that men will take them seriously. So and also I'm a woman, so I feel like I can come in with a little bit more heat, at women. And I'm not saying that men are totally off the hook right? They need to be willing to listen and learn as well, but I don't have control over them, right? I have control and can speak into women more distinctly. And so I would just encourage women that are in those male-dominated fields. Like, at the end of the day, people want to know that you're a hard worker. People want to know that you're bought in to their system and to their family. And they will recognize, like, when you're good at your job, they will listen to you. And so I would say, just keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
Talk when it's appropriate, be professional, don't be catty, and just don't roll your eyes, that type of attitude. Like, we have got to just work alongside and say, I have information because I'm a woman that you don't have.
Right.
Why don't we just talk about it? And I would love for you to implement it. So I hope that takes on a much more like humble approach rather than just being like, I cannot believe they don't know this, And most of the time, men don't even know like about like periods until they get married, because then they are living in close quarters with a woman that they are like intimate with and they like talk with. And so at some point, it's like, and we have to be willing to just teach them along the way. It'll be okay. Is it sometimes silly? Like, of course it's going to be silly, but I just would encourage women, like, if you are in a role where you have the ability to speak into the lives of men, then the best thing you can do is be incredibly professional and good at your job, because that will earn you a lot of respect.
No, I'm super thankful you touched on that, because the professional aspect plays a huge role, I think, in a professional environment when we're talking about these are intimate conversations. So I just appreciate your approach to that. So let's go ahead, just take the bull by the horns. Let's dive into like aerobic capacity for women, and just aside from our like circadian rhythm differences, how do our training physical body differences change the way that we should approach training?
Sure. So we can kick it off, like you said, with cardio training. So we already know that men's, lungs, hearts, their cardiovascular system is larger just by size, which means that they have higher stroke volumes, meaning that their body can pump blood harder and faster than women. And that's due to going through puberty and having testosterone, which is an anabolic hormone, meaning it's going to rebuild and repair, build up, right? That's why men's bodies are typically larger. So when we're talking about cardio, their cardiovascular system is actually larger and more efficient. However, women actually have a really unique endurance bias, meaning that women are more metabolically flexible. We can tap into our carbs and our fat stores a little bit better than men can. Men are very carbohydrate dominant. Women have more type 1 muscle fibers, which is your endurance muscle fibers, where men have more type 2 muscle fibers. Type 2 muscle fibers have a byproduct of lactate, meaning that they have a much lower lactate threshold, where women, because we have more type 1 muscle fibers, means that we build up less lactate, meaning that we can go longer and do more repetitions, or when it's cardio based, we can just, if our heart rate is low enough, we can just go and go and go and go and go, where men will bonk. Another thing that's more interesting is because we have more type 1 muscle fibers, and because we can maintain our blood volume a little bit better because we sweat less, we will also cramp less. So when we're talking about cardio training in general, women are more endurance biased based off of not only our metabolic pathways, but also our musculature. And sorry, I had one more in my brain that I can't remember. Let's see. Carbohydrates. It'll probably come to me in just a second. I had three of them in my brain that I always talk about, but apparently I'm only going to give you two. But it's also an interesting thing, and that kind of closes the gap cardiovascular wise between men and women. And we're seeing that in endurance sports. We see that women are winning the Appalachian Trail, where women are winning ultra marathons. They're winning marathons. They're winning all of these long endurance races. And I will say men have been in formalized sports much longer than women have been. So you have generations and generations of men in formalized sports, which will obviously, women are going to be a little bit more disadvantaged on just that aspect alone. But if you're looking at the longer the race, the more chance a woman has of winning it. So, you could think about that in formalized sports. You could also think about that in the tactical setting. Oh, I've remembered my third one.
Go for it.
Women are more quad dominant. Women are more quad dominant because we have hips that are wider than our knees. And because of that angle, that Q angle that we have between our hips and knees, our glutes are not going to be the primary, which means our quads are going to be the primary. And we're talking about running or cycling or other endurance sports, your quads are heavily used. And so again, endurance bias in regards to your quads, so your musculature. And so anyways, the longer the race, the more of a chance a woman has of winning it, which is really cool. Another thing that kind of plays into that, obviously, is like, especially in a military setting and also in like endurance sports, the sheer number of men doing them is much more than women doing it. Like less women are in the military, less women are doing ultra marathons. So it can seem like a lot more men are winning or doing those things, which is the truth. But when you go like person for person, if you were to do
ratio,
exactly, if you were to do 50% men, 50% women, and you took the best, like that gap in endurance sports is very close. Whereas in power-based sports, it's going to lean heavily towards men. And when you look at the most power-based sports, so things like Olympic weightlifting or powerlifting, certain events in track and field, right? There's going to be up to a 30% gap between men and women. And that's because men have a power bias. And because that is due to them having more type 2 muscle fibers, which are your strength and power fibers. They have, they're much more posterior dominant, meaning that they have a really high power output in general, just based on their musculature. And they're more carbohydrate dominant, meaning that their body is more efficient at using carbohydrates within the muscles themselves rather than women wanting to tap into their fat stores. So, when it comes to the differences between males and females in a cardio setting, women, if you're doing long intervals, women will probably recover faster in between each interval, where men might need a little bit more recovery. You could give a guy 5 minutes rest per se in between an interval. A girl might just be back to normal at 2 to 3 minutes. So, we always talk about the negatives between men and women. We're always like, women are worse. Hold on now. You take an elite female athlete and put her up against a male athlete, an elite male athlete, there's a good chance that her recovery might even be better than his. So that's really cool. Not a lot of people talk about that. Yeah. Did you have any questions about that one?
No, I think it's just interesting because my husband always talks about like, I just want big legs. And he's like, you have big legs. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, why do girls always have big legs? I'm like, well, that's why, babe. We're quad dominant. So I just giggle when I first listened to your presentation about that. And then the other thing is like, I remember in college, he was doing all the Army ROTC stuff, but also just like, it was college. So he was like doing cheer and rugby, and he had the capacity to be in the gym 2 times a day. And I remember he had this, I think, a similar conversation with a friend that was studying fitness. And she was like, yeah, like inherently you shouldn't be able to do these 2 things. Like you shouldn't be able to like capitalize on your endurance training as much as you're doing your strength training. And my husband's response was, well, I am. So yeah, it just makes me laugh because I think that also, if we take it for what it is, was a nourishment difference. My husband, at that time that he was probably in peak physical shape prior to doing Ranger School and some of these, high stress training seasons, was eating super well. He was, he was eating
Mm-hmm.
at 4,000 calories a day to be able to sustain
Mm-hmm.
that. Versus now, I'm like, bro, we just don't have the budget for you to do that. Like, we need you to pass your PT test. We're not, So I just laugh because I can imagine people will comment on your content and be like, well, I'm the exception to the rule because look at how I'm training.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, I think people are discrediting the foundation of nutrition and fueling when it comes to aerobic and strength capacity for men and women.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even more so when you're talking about female athletes, right? Like we've discussed that several times at this point, is guys can usually, especially if they're in like their prime years, up until like 28, 29, 30, like before that time frame, guys can drink all the, I'm not condoning this, but they can drink all the Monsters, all the Red Bulls, all the alcohol, especially in the military, right? Take in all the nicotine, not sleep, and they're going to be shredded. They will be jacked. And I see that every single day, at work. And I'm thinking, okay, you're going to hit about 28, 29, 30, and your body's going to kind of catch up to you and we'll make some adjustments, right? But for female athletes, they just do not have that type of recovery. And that's not a dig. It's the truth, right?
Nope. Yeah.
And like I said, men are much more linear, whereas women do not have as much of it. I call it a recovery buffer. So if women are not sleeping, if they're not fueling, if they're not doing their mobility, if they're not, what's it called? Like getting into their parasympathetic nervous systems, if they are always stressed out, under eating, under sleeping, they will not be able to compete in the same ways that men will. And again, that's not a dig, it's reality, it's the truth, right?
Yeah.
So how that flushes out in the military is, they do night ops, and if I have all of my Joes coming back and they didn't sleep, they're probably gonna be okay. But if I have Jane coming back and she didn't sleep, then maybe I'm going to give Jane a rest day. And then I'm going to tell Jane, hey, we need to eat enough food today. We need to drink enough water. And then we're going to come back. We're going to hit the same training. But that recovery buffer just does not look the same. And so, again, it's not pandering. It's just understanding as a coach what adjustments I'm making. Now, when it comes to the musculoskeletal system, I touched on the different muscle fibers, but other things that play a huge factor, especially in a military setting, is women have obviously wider hips where men carry a lot of musculature up top, and that really affects a rucking gait economy. And so, when you're rucking, you're going to have, your shoulder straps, you're going to have a chest clip, and you're going to also have a hip belt. And normally, if you've rucked with a heavy load, you will know that there's a weight difference in distribution between using your chest clip and shoulder straps versus your hip belt. Once you clip your hip belt, your legs feel really heavy. And so if you can then build up the musculature on a female to have stronger traps and stronger delts and a stronger pec and stronger upper body, then she may be able to capitalize on using a shoulder straps and her chest clip more than using her hip belt, which will directly impact how fast she's going to be able to move with her ruck on. Because if you're using your hip belt, this is getting super niche, but like if you're using just your hip belt, your legs are going to feel a lot heavier. So there's an advantage there to having really strong traps as a girl in that regard. Other things like women have typically smaller hands. So if you give the same object to women versus men, like a jerry can or an ammo can, or a farmer's carry of any sort, she's going to have a much more palm dominant grip because her fingers are shorter, where men will be able to just carry those objects in their fingers and be fine. So sometimes women start complaining about their forearms or their elbows start bothering them. So it's advantageous for coaches to really build up the forearm strength of their female service members if that's something that they're going to experience. Other things like men, because they carry a lot of their weight in their upper body naturally, their delts and their traps have a lot of testosterone receptors. Excuse me. So their delts and traps get really strong really fast, and that has an advantage in being able to do upper body pulling. So if you have a service member that has to do a lot of pull-ups, then female service members need to do a lot of hypertrophy in the upper body, but not a lot of hypertrophy in the lower body because, like you said, their legs are already probably pretty big for the most part. For the most part, unless they're like, a phenomenal runner, then they're probably going to have a little bit of a thinner stature. But for the most part, women can really use a lot of hypertrophy in the upper body and strength and power in their lower body.
Yeah. So what would you say to all of the crunchy moms that have taken over the rucking rage?
One, I will always commend people when they are taking a hold of their fitness. I will always commend it. Two, I love that they're doing weight-bearing exercises. Love it. Three, I think it's hilarious that the crunchy women have taken over something that has been a miserable form of exercise for our, gruntiest men in American history. That's hilarious to me, that they're taking over this form of exercise. But in all seriousness, I think it's great. The only thing that I'm a little hesitant of is women will do anything not to lift a weight in a weight room. They will go to a spin class. They will go to a dance class. They will go rucking. They will do anything. But Lord have mercy, they will not strength train. And so I don't want them to not ruck. Right? Like I love that they're doing that, but it's not going to substitute for a periodized, undulating, progressive overload strength and conditioning program. And that's always where I'm going to be pointing people towards.
Yes and amen. Because that's exactly what I was going to say is I think that many women have now seen this advantageous trend that will take the place of strength training, and it does not.
Yeah, it does not. No, and like I said before, right? Where do we get all these positive hormonal responses? 90, 95, 100% intensity.
Yeah, it's testing the upper limit. Yep.
It's testing the upper limit, whether that's on a bike, you're going all out sprints for 10 seconds and then you're resting, or that means in a strength training capacity where you're hitting reps of 1 to 3, and those reps are super freaking heavy. That's where you see that positive progressive overload. And rucking, again, while it's a weight-bearing exercise, and I'm not going to bash it, you can walk with that for an hour. And you'll have some positive musculoskeletal changes with your soft tissue and all of that and your bone mineral density, but you're just not hitting the same type of intensity that you are in a strength training program.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next topic that I'm really excited to cover, if you could give us like a loose week, like a week of training, again, and you already kind of talked about how we'll differentiate that between a follicular and luteal phase. Like my luteal phase this week, I had 2 workouts to do for my Olympic lifting, and I was like, nope, these are going to all be trash. It was like, I dropped the weight, dropped the intensity, and then lo and behold, my period started and I feel like trash. I'm like, this is not, we're not going to peak. Just give me a number 3 to 4 days to thaw out. That being said, from a follicular standpoint, all stars are aligned. You're feeling great. You're rested. You're nourished. What would a week of, I guess, like perfect movements, if you could recommend loosely, like ladies, if you're going to start tomorrow and you feel great and you're eating great and you're sleeping great, this is what you should do.
Love it. So this is my typical breakdown. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, strength training. And you're hitting what I call all 8 main movements. So that's going to be squatting, hinging, pushing, pulling, single leg, rotation, anti-rotation, and loaded carries. So, if you want to break that down, maybe you're hitting a bench press on a Monday. That's going to be your main compound lift. Wednesday, you're deadlifting. Friday, you're squatting. And then all of those other movements you can do as accessories. So, you're lunging, you're doing box step ups, you're doing push-ups, you're doing ring rows, you're doing overhead presses, you're doing farmer's carries. Like there's a million different things you can do, but those are all considered accessories. But you want to hit all 8 of those 2 to 3 times within that week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, break that down. And in order to work on your strength and power, especially on your compound lifts, you need to, over the course of the weeks, you need to trim your repetitions and increase your load or intensity. So quick example, maybe let's talk about Mondays, right? Bench press. You can start week 1 can be 4 by 10, and then the next week will be 4 by 8, assuming that the weights you chose went up. And the next week, 4 by 6, weights are still going up. Next week, maybe 5 by 5. And then, of course, your weight has drastically changed and you are getting stronger. You're giving not only your musculature a new stimulus each week because it's heavier, but you're also giving your central nervous system a new stimulus, and it's having to overcome that. So it's great. And then when it comes to Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, that's what I call my cardio days, basically, but different forms of cardio. So it's very important to know the difference. On Tuesdays, I like to make those days my sprint interval days. Now, that doesn't mean you have to run to sprint. You can get on a bike, you can get on a rower, you can swim, but that just means you're hitting those top end intensities really, really, really hard, really fast, but then you're resting in between each interval, because the goal is to repeat the speed, repeat the force, repeat the intensity on each of those interval bouts. That's Tuesdays. Thursdays, I'm going to say more moderate intervals. So if we're going to talk running, that would be maybe, 800 repeats or 1 mile repeats, where the intensity is a little bit lower, but you're accumulating a decent amount of volume. So like longer interval days, still resting in between each interval, but you're just accumulating more volume. And then Saturdays, if you're in a really structured training program, then that would look like a really long session of heart rate zone 2. Or if you're not, then I say Saturdays is where you get outside and you do something that you love. So that could be a walk with your kids, a hike, gardening, mowing your lawn, something fun, but it's outside, no sunscreen, no sunglasses, just in a hat, enjoying, those crunchy things, grounding, all that. So that's kind of the breakdown. And then Sunday will always be like your biggest and fullest rest day.
Yeah. Which I'm super excited. We found a walking pad. So I'm like, yay, just like simple ways to like increase NEAT, because my son just started preschool. So I have a little bit more capacity of like working from home. But I've noticed even in the past 2 weeks, I'm like, I am not moving, just the simple shift to like working on podcast stuff or working on my laptop or like reading on my Kindle. Like I'm sitting so much more, which makes complete sense as to why we have a health and obesity epidemic. But that's neither here nor there. We can kind of use that as a transition to the next topic of, I just like to hear your thoughts on big pharma, big food, and like you mentioned a little bit earlier, big fitness, because I don't think that people realize big fitness is something that is coming out a lot more and has pretty dangerous like repercussions if we don't recognize it early.
Absolutely. And I'll give the caveat, this is not to like convince people not to exercise or like not go to a fitness class, right? Like that's not the point.
Right.
I just want to take it like a little bit deeper and like ultimately this topic, like I want it to point back to like understanding your value in Christ, ultimately. But what is big fitness? It's this idea that it's this gigantic industry that takes advantage of your insecurities and creates it creates a lifetime customer. And so, if you want to equate that to big pharma or big tech or big food, right? What typically are the attributes of those? It's usually a lifetime customer. It's a dependent customer. It's a customer that can't think for themselves, and it's going to be the industry is going to tell you how to move forward. It's going to tell you that we have the magic pill, or we have the thing that will make your life more valuable, right? You're thinking about big pharma, that's going to be probably medication. If you think about big fitness, that's going to be like, we have the golden ticket to losing weight. Come here and you will have a wonderful life, right?
Yep.
And they all honestly kind of feed into each other, right? We all know that.
Yeah.
Big tech, big food, big pharma, big fitness, they all kind of feed into each other. And the example I always use is when I was in my undergrad and I had gotten my very first fitness certification. I was an exercise physiologist through the American College of Sports Medicine, and my mind was blown when I learned that Coca-Cola was the number one funder and financial donator to the American College of Sports Medicine, because Coca-Cola wanted to make sure that the mantra was that exercise is medicine, not food. And Coca-Cola had that idea. Woof. Yeah, they wanted to make sure that food was never the culprit. Food was never the problem. Exercise is the problem, right? And so obviously I work somewhat in the fitness industry. I work in that world. But it's just, one, you have to understand that there are ties to all of that. Two, I talk about this a lot on different podcasts, but the reality is like your health is never supposed to be tied to your value. And that is going to be rooted in understanding like you are created in the image of God and your health is objective. And we get our value from understanding that we were made in the image of God. And so even if you are, obese or you're super thin, you're fit or you're unhealthy, you all have the same value in the eyes of God. But what that doesn't mean is that we all have the same quality of life. We absolutely do not, and that should spur you towards, out of humility, going, whoa, wow, I can have a wonderful, memory-filled, adventure-filled life if I am more fit. And and again, if you're a Christian, then that's like loving more people, serving more people, being able to do more things with more people because you're physically capable of doing it. But what Big Fitness tells you is that, hey, if you join our gym, and we already talked about this community, right? If you join our mantra, if you join our community, if you join our cult, if you join our XYZ, if you just do it this way, you're going to have the best life. You're going to be the most fit. You're going to have more value in your life. And I think what they're really talking about is quality of life. But you always, this is just... It's sad. It's the truth. Who are the most like discontent people with their bodies? It's going to be bodybuilders. It's literally people who have, quote unquote, by society standards, the best physiques, and yet they are shells of human beings because they are getting their value and how they look. So I'm always just screaming from the rooftops that, hey, we should be fit because of quality of life. It should be like an outward expression of how we value ourselves and where we get our value from. But in and of itself, like the fitness industry will 1,000% take advantage of your insecurities. Just like, use another example, the makeup industry, right? They take advantage of female insecurities to get you to buy makeup, to change who you are, to say that like you're more valuable in society if you look a certain way and you wear a certain makeup, right? And if you, like you said, look a certain way. So I just am always like kind of sifting through and trying to articulate more of that of, Big Fitness is going to take advantage of your insecurities. And that has spurred me on in my own life and in my own, small business to like never share, progress photos. I'm never sharing, progress photos of myself or my clients, because what happens on the other end of that is a woman looking at her phone screen, seeing me or seeing another individual that has changed themselves and hopefully living a better quality of life, which is great. But then that woman then becomes my client because I have shared, a half naked photo of somebody else. Like that just feels, once you boil it down, you're like, oh my gosh, I am taking advantage of people's insecurities. And when you work in the fitness industry, people will throw themselves at you to have you fix them. And when you have horrible motives, you can exploit that and you can get a lot of money out of people. And I think that's what happens, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I'm just really big on saying, let's lay the foundation first from where we get our value from. And then from there, let's improve our quality of life by having, more muscle mass, having healthier body composition, for example.
Yeah. 1,000%. And it's using your body as a business card, Yeah. And it wasn't until several years ago that I understood that literally through Christ humbling me, that even if I trained and ate exactly to the T as friends of mine or other women on Instagram that I was comparing myself to, I would physiologically never look like them because I am 5'8", broad-shouldered, like I am dense, so I will never ever look like another Jane that I'm comparing myself to that is 5'3", real thin, even post baby, because our bodies were built differently. So I just appreciate your approach as a coach, as a woman that is serving women in this capacity, because not many people have that approach, especially with a Christ-like mindset of knowing that ultimately, even if you were peak 1% fitness, your identity is still rooted in the Lord and the way that he created you to love and serve others.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's not to say like we shouldn't go like get fit and like try to get 6-packs. Like that's fine. Whatever.
Sure.
Do what you want,
Yeah.
It's just like, misplaced value will always be, will leave you longing. So I think that transcends to big fitness for sure.
Yes, Kelsee, I've loved these conversations. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Our closing question, like always, would be if you could provide any wisdom to your younger self or to our community that is listening, what would you share?
Ooh, I think, I remember answering this question last time and, man, okay. Wisdom I would share with my younger self. I would say, to trust that, God's system is the most flourishing, to truly understand that like God created us, to our bodies to heal themselves, to have the environment heal itself. Our only job is to steward it and to be good stewards rather than to think that I can, take my body or, food or the environment as an idol. I would have wanted to know years ago that like, what? God's design is a design for a reason, and it's going to be the most flourishing and the most blessed when we just understand that concept.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelsee. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your platform. I will link all of your stuff to get plugged in with you. And man, I just appreciate you, friend.
Yes. Thank you so much for giving me the platform to talk about some of my favorite things. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. We're here for it. And we'll catch you guys on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening, friend. If today's episode resonated with you, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps our community grow, and I'd be so grateful for your support. Looking for a break from the hurried health lifestyle? Check out my Return to Rest ebook for simple healing habits. And if you're craving a more intentional community, join Restore, the healing collective for the weary woman, a space where we dive into rest with a lens of faith and regular accountability. For more wellness inspiration, follow along at Instagram at WiselyWell or visit livingwiselywell.com for everything from podcast episodes to budget-friendly tips. Thanks again for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next episode.